In 1995, J.K. Rowling was an unemployed single mother, surviving on £70 a week, battling severe depression, and quietly admitting she had considered ending her life. Just 7 years later, words written in cold cafés turned into a global empire worth over $7.7 billion, selling 500 million books in 80-plus languages. What happened between those two numbers, and what did it truly cost her to survive? The most brutal truth about J.K. Rowling is this: Harry Potter was not born from hope, it was written to escape despair. At her lowest point, Rowling described herself as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain, without being homeless. She was divorced, unemployed, a single mother, diagnosed with clinical depression. Some days, the only reason she left her apartment was to sit in cafes she couldn't afford, because the warmth was free, and silence at home was unbearable. The irony is cruel: while her life was collapsing, she was writing about belonging, friendship, and a boy who survived when he shouldn't have. Her manuscript was rejected 12 times. One publisher accepted it only after a secretary's 8-year-old daughter begged to read more. Even then, Rowling was advised to get a day job, because children's books didn't make money. What kept her going wasn't belief in success. It was something darker and stronger. She later said that failure had stripped away everything unessential, leaving only what mattered: her story, her voice, and the refusal to disappear. The world sees magic, fame, and billions. But the truth is simpler, and more disturbing. Harry Potter exists because its creator survived a place where many don't. To understand how J.K. Rowling survived the darkest chapter of her adult life, you have to return to where her inner world was first shaped: her childhood. Rowling was not raised in chaos, but she was raised in quiet emotional tension. Her home was stable on the surface, yet distant underneath. Her parents' marriage was unhappy, marked by arguments and emotional coldness. There was no dramatic trauma, but there was something more subtle and lasting: a feeling of not fully belonging. As a child, Rowling learned early to retreat inward. She spent long hours alone, inventing stories, creating characters, imagining worlds where rules made sense, where courage mattered, where loyalty was rewarded, and where pain always meant something. Writing was not encouraged as a career. It wasn't discouraged either. It was simply not taken seriously. That invisibility stayed with her. The most profound influence of her childhood, however, was her mother. Rowling's mother was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis while Rowling was still young, a slow, degenerative illness that quietly rewrote the family's future. Rowling watched, helplessly, as someone she loved grew weaker year by year. This experience planted a seed that would later define her work: the presence of death, loss, and fear, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. When her mother died in 1990, Rowling was only 25. She never had the chance to tell her mother that she was writing a novel. She never saw her daughter publish a word. Years later, Rowling admitted that Harry Potter would not exist in the same form if her mother had lived. The orphan child. The absent parents. The longing for guidance from figures who are gone too soon. These were not literary devices. They were emotional truths. Rowling has said that much of her writing came from unresolved grief that had no language at the time, no safe place to land. Instead of escaping pain, she learned to observe it, to study it, to sit with it long enough that it transformed into story. School did not offer her refuge either. She was not particularly popular. Not particularly confident. Not extraordinary by external standards. But she was observant. Quiet. Absorbing everything. That habit, watching from the edges, would later allow her to write characters who felt real, flawed, and deeply human. Long before fame, Rowling had already learned 3 survival skills. First, she learned how to be alone without disappearing. Second, she learned how to use imagination as structure, not fantasy. And third, she learned that pain does not vanish, it accumulates, waiting to be shaped. By the time adulthood arrived with its failures, divorces, and depressions, Rowling had already built something invisible but powerful: an inner world strong enough to hold unbearable emotions. Harry Potter did not begin on a train. It began in a childhood where imagination became shelter, and storytelling became a way to make sense of things that could not be fixed. The foundation was laid long before success ever appeared. The question was never whether Rowling could write a story. It was whether she could survive long enough to finish it. After university, J.K. Rowling did not step into clarity. There was no moment where the path revealed itself. No sudden sense of arrival. Instead, adulthood began quietly, through temporary jobs, office work, and routines that paid the bills but offered no sense of direction. She knew she could write, but writing did not resemble a future. It felt more like a private instinct, something that existed apart from real life, something that could not yet support it. So she learned how to function without feeling aligned. Her days were practical. Her inner world was not. That separation grew heavier with time. Searching for movement rather than answers, Rowling left Britain for Portugal to teach English. It looked like a fresh start, but it was closer to a pause, a way to place distance between herself and the feeling that her life was not forming the way it was supposed to. In Portugal, she continued to write, quietly and without expectation. Not for publication. Not for recognition. Writing had become the one place where her thoughts stopped scattering. It was there that she married. For a moment, it seemed like adulthood had finally taken shape. A job. A home. A relationship. The appearance of stability. But stability built too quickly revealed its weakness just as fast. The marriage was marked by emotional strain and, eventually, violence. What had seemed like grounding became another source of fear. And once again, Rowling learned that structure does not guarantee safety. The marriage ended abruptly. Rowling returned to the UK with her infant daughter, carrying emotional shock, exhaustion, and the quiet shame of another failed attempt at building a life that worked. Edinburgh became the setting for a life reduced to survival. She was unemployed. She lived on government assistance. Every decision revolved around keeping her child safe and herself functioning. This was not a chapter she had imagined. But it was the chapter that refused to erase her. Despite everything collapsing around her, one thing remained disturbingly constant: the story she had been carrying for years. The idea that first appeared on a train did not vanish under pressure. It did not fade with fear. It grew clearer. Writing did not stop because it could not afford to. The process was unglamorous. She wrote wherever warmth was free. Cafés became workspaces because they were heated. Pages were written between feedings, through fatigue, under the constant awareness that time and energy were limited. There was no inspiration waiting to arrive, only discipline. And yet, the world she was building became more precise. Harry Potter was no longer an escape. It became structure. Each chapter imposed order on a life that felt increasingly unstable. Revising was not about perfection, it was about control. About making something hold together when everything else felt fragile. Writing gave her a sense of continuity when her personal life offered none. This was not belief in success. It was refusal to disappear. When Rowling eventually began submitting the manuscript to publishers, she did not imagine triumph. She imagined continuation. Acceptance meant survival. Rejection meant returning to a life that already felt impossible. When rejection letters arrived, they confirmed her fears, but they did not stop her. By that point, the story had outgrown hope. It had become necessity. Harry Potter was no longer something she wanted to write. It was something she could not afford to abandon. Long before success arrived, Rowling had already made her most important decision, not to chase certainty, but to stay aligned with the one thing that still felt true. The world had not yet said yes. But the path was already chosen. The question was no longer whether the story would succeed. It was whether she could endure long enough for the world to finally notice it. Success did not arrive as a celebration for J.K. Rowling. It arrived as acceleration. The first book was published quietly. There were no guarantees, no grand expectations. Yet something began to move beneath the surface. Children talked. Teachers recommended it. Parents noticed. The story passed from hand to hand before the industry fully understood what it was witnessing. Momentum replaced doubt. Sales grew faster than prediction models. Foreign rights followed. Sequels were demanded before the first book had finished its initial run. What had been written in isolation now required deadlines, coordination, expansion. Rowling was no longer just finishing a story, she was sustaining a world. And the world wanted more. Within a few years, Harry Potter was no longer a book series. It became a cultural event. Translations multiplied. Midnight releases turned into rituals. Readers aged alongside the characters. The story grew darker, heavier, more complex, and the audience stayed. So did the pressure. Rowling was suddenly visible everywhere. Interviews condensed her life into headlines. Her past was reshaped into myth. Poverty became a prelude. Survival became branding. The narrative simplified what had never been simple. She was called an inspiration. But inspiration carries weight. Film studios arrived with numbers that felt unreal. Contracts expanded into years, then decades. Rowling demanded creative control, not out of power, but fear. She had lived inside this world when no one wanted it. She refused to let it be hollowed out now that everyone did. Power, however, does not arrive without consequence. The films transformed imagination into permanence. Characters now had faces. Scenes became fixed. The story could no longer belong entirely to the reader, or to its creator. What once lived fluidly in the mind became public property. Visibility replaced privacy. Financially, the ascent was historic. Rowling became the most successful author of her generation. Then the most successful living author. Then the first writer to surpass billionaire status through books alone. The numbers exceeded storytelling. They turned into spectacle. And yet, the irony remained unresolved. She was writing about power, while holding more than she ever wanted. She was writing about choice, while her life offered fewer of them. She was writing about humility, while the world elevated her beyond it. Success did not erase the past. It amplified contrast. The woman who once counted coins now navigated influence. The writer who once hid now lived under constant observation. Every word carried consequence. Every silence invited interpretation. And expectation became permanent. Each new book was no longer judged on its own terms. It was measured against itself. Against nostalgia. Against cultural ownership. Against the idea that this story belonged to everyone. Creativity shifted. Writing, once an act of survival, became performance under pressure. Rowling still worked obsessively, still revised relentlessly, but the emotional stakes had changed. Failure was no longer personal. It would be public. It would be amplified. There was no space to disappear. As the series progressed, the story reflected its creator's internal landscape. Innocence faded. Death became unavoidable. Moral choices hardened into consequences that could not be undone. Some readers resisted the darkness. Rowling did not. She believed honesty mattered more than comfort. Ending the series after 7 books was not a business decision. It was a boundary. To continue indefinitely would hollow out meaning. To stop meant stepping away from guaranteed dominance. Walking away from the thing that saved you is not triumph. It is risk. When the final book was released, records shattered. Lines wrapped around buildings. The world celebrated closure. Fans mourned. History was declared. But something quieter happened underneath. Structure vanished. For years, Harry Potter had given Rowling rhythm, identity, and purpose. Each book answered the question of what came next. Now there was silence. Freedom, but without direction. Space, but without shape. Success had delivered her to an unfamiliar place. Not survival. Not struggle. But aftermath. The world assumed this was the ending. It was not. Because success does not resolve the questions that suffering creates. It only removes urgency. What remains is confrontation, with identity, with meaning, with the cost of having everything you once needed. The peak had been reached. The question now was not how she would rise again. It was whether she could survive what came after the climb. At the height of her success, J.K. Rowling was no longer fighting to survive. She was fighting to remain stable. From the outside, the story appeared complete. Poverty had ended. Recognition was permanent. Influence was undeniable. The world assumed the struggle belonged to the past. But internally, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Pain without a clear reason, fear without an obvious threat. When Rowling was poor, despair had context. When she was successful, it did not. Depression did not disappear with money. It became harder to justify, harder to explain, harder to admit. Gratitude was expected. Strength was assumed. Vulnerability felt inappropriate. The same mind that once struggled to endure scarcity now carried a different kind of weight, constant attention, constant expectation, constant evaluation. There was no silence anymore. Rowling had described depression not as sadness, but as absence. a hollowing out of feeling. A sense that warmth once existed somewhere, but could no longer be reached. During her lowest years, she could name that feeling. During her highest years, she could not. And unnamed pain isolates more deeply than visible suffering. The Dementors were born from that place. Not as symbolism, but as memory. They represented exactly what she experienced, the draining of warmth, the erosion of hope, the certainty that happiness belonged to a version of yourself that no longer existed. Millions read those pages as fantasy. Few recognized them as confession. Writing had once been shelter. Now it was exposure. Fame altered the relationship between creator and creation. Harry Potter no longer belonged to the woman who wrote to survive. It belonged to readers, studios, critics, and expectations that multiplied faster than anyone could manage. Each book release became an event. Each sentence was weighed. Each silence was interpreted. Rowling was no longer allowed to process privately. Her life was compressed into a narrative others preferred. The past was romanticized. The pain was edited into inspiration. The story became simpler than the truth. There was no space left for relapse, contradiction, or fragility. Strength became obligation. Gratitude became performance. The world celebrated resilience, but had little patience for its cost. As attention intensified, Rowling encountered a new fear, not fear of failure, but fear of reduction. Reduction to a symbol. Reduction to a lesson. Reduction to a version of herself that could no longer change without consequence. Disagreement no longer arrived quietly. It arrived everywhere at once. Support and hostility existed at the same volume, leaving no room for nuance. For someone who had already lived with mental instability, this environment created psychological enclosure. There was nowhere to stand outside of reaction. Visibility removed distance. Every thought became potential controversy. Every choice carried consequences beyond intention. Silence suggested guilt. Speech invited attack. Retreat suggested weakness. Choice narrowed. Creativity suffered under that pressure. Writing under her own name felt increasingly impossible. The work was no longer allowed to exist on its own terms. It was measured against legacy, nostalgia, and cultural ownership. Rowling did not want applause. She wanted to know whether her voice still existed. That question lingered beneath everything she did, unspoken but constant, as the realization slowly formed that the thing which once saved her life had now become a source of profound instability. The climb was over. The crisis had begun. What followed was not collapse, but erosion. For J.K. Rowling, the danger was no longer immediate despair. It was duration. The slow wearing down of boundaries, identity, and internal safety. Fame did not strike once and leave. It stayed. It watched. It waited. Every opinion she expressed began to exist outside of her control the moment it left her. Context dissolved. Nuance evaporated. Meaning was decided elsewhere. She discovered that visibility does not amplify truth, it fragments it. And fragmentation is exhausting. Rowling realized that pain now operated differently. She could no longer grieve privately. She could no longer process uncertainty without it becoming public material. Silence was interpreted. Speech was dissected. Neither offered relief. There was no neutral ground. This created a new kind of fear, not fear of being wrong, but fear of being permanently fixed in the eyes of others. Once defined, deviation became betrayal. Once admired, complexity became threat. The public version of herself hardened faster than she could evolve. She was still changing. The world was not interested. What hurt most was not opposition, but reduction. Her life, her work, her intentions were flattened into arguments she did not recognize. She was spoken about more than spoken to, interpreted more than understood. The distance between her internal reality and external perception widened until it became unbridgeable. And isolation returned. Not the isolation of poverty. Not the isolation of invisibility. But the isolation of being everywhere, and nowhere at once. Writing, once again, became the pressure point. Under her own name, every sentence carried weight far beyond intention. The act of creation no longer felt private or exploratory. It felt surveilled. Judged before it existed. Expected to perform a function it was never meant to serve. So she stepped away. Writing under a pseudonym was not reinvention. It was retreat into truth. A controlled disappearance. A way to test something essential. Could she exist creatively without the shadow of herself? The answer arrived quietly. Yes. The relief was immediate and unsettling. For the first time in years, the work was allowed to fail. To be average. To be imperfect. Reviews were honest. Expectations were proportional. The writing breathed. And in that breathing space, Rowling recognized what she had lost. Not fame. Not wealth. But permission. Permission to explore without consequence. Permission to be misunderstood without punishment. Permission to exist without explanation. This realization cut deeper than any criticism. It meant that success had not only given her power, it had taken something fundamental in return. The freedom to be unfinished. At the core of this crisis was identity displacement. Rowling had survived by building structure through story. Now her own story had been taken from her. Retold. Simplified. Claimed. Even her pain had become symbolic. To reclaim herself meant accepting conflict as permanent. It meant choosing coherence over consensus. Integrity over comfort. And that choice came with loss, of admiration, of simplicity, of safety. She did not choose it easily. But she chose it deliberately. What makes this chapter truly dark is not scandal or controversy. It is endurance without relief. Rowling did not escape. She did not disappear. She stayed present inside a narrative that no longer belonged to her, absorbing pressure that few can withstand without breaking. But survival had already taught her something essential. Pain does not disappear when you outgrow it. It returns in different forms, demanding different responses. This time, survival would not be proven by endurance alone. It would be proven by choice. The crisis was no longer about writing. It was about authorship, of self, of meaning, of life beyond expectation. And standing at that edge, stripped of illusion, stripped of approval, stripped of protection, Rowling faced the quiet question that would shape what came next. Could she choose herself again, even if doing so meant standing alone? The turning point for J.K. Rowling did not come with resolution. It came with acceptance. There was no moment when pressure eased or misunderstanding dissolved. No apology from the world. No return to the safety she once believed success would provide. What changed was quieter and far more difficult. Rowling stopped expecting stability to arrive from the outside. She understood something essential at last. Safety was never guaranteed. Not by obscurity. Not by success. Not even by survival. What she could choose was alignment. For years, Rowling had endured by holding on, to work, to discipline, to the belief that persistence alone would eventually fix everything. Now endurance required a different shape. Instead of resisting conflict, she allowed it to exist. Instead of managing perception, she let go of the illusion that perception could ever be controlled. Letting go did not mean surrender. It meant recalibration. She stopped trying to be understood by everyone. She stopped writing to clarify herself to the world. The work no longer needed to defend her or explain her. It only needed to be honest. Writing returned to its original function, not as performance, but as structure. A way to remain internally coherent in a landscape that no longer offered external coherence. This was not rebellion. It was grounding. Rowling had already learned how to survive collapse. Poverty had taught her that. Depression had sharpened it. Fame had tested it. Now survival demanded something quieter, the refusal to fragment under contradiction. She could be successful and unsettled. Visible and misunderstood. Admired and contested. None of these states canceled the others. This was rebirth not as transformation, but as integration. She began to redefine success away from scale and toward coherence. Away from approval and toward sustainability. A life no longer measured by how widely it was accepted, but by whether it could be lived without constant self-erasure. Choice returned, not the choice to be liked, but the choice to be aligned. Rowling understood that the story she had lived through would never resolve into a clean arc. There would be no final redemption scene. No universal agreement. No return to invisibility. What she could reclaim was authorship, not over how others saw her, but over how she responded to being seen. This was the same truth embedded in her fiction all along. Power does not corrupt by existing. It corrupts when it replaces conscience. By choosing alignment over control, Rowling reclaimed something she had nearly lost, the ability to inhabit her own life without constant defense. She no longer needed to be the symbol the world demanded. She only needed to remain consistent with the values that had once carried her through collapse. Rebirth, in this sense, was not beginning again. It was choosing again. Choosing to live without guarantees. Choosing to speak without certainty of reception. Choosing to remain whole in a world that prefers simplicity. The turning point was not dramatic. It was durable. Rowling did not emerge untouched. She emerged anchored. Grounded in the understanding that survival is not proven once, but repeatedly, through decisions that often cost more than they reward. This time, survival was no longer about escaping pain. It was about refusing to abandon herself to avoid it. Life after the storm did not feel triumphant for J.K. Rowling. It felt quieter, more deliberate, less performative. The absence of constant escalation created space, not comfort, but space. A life no longer organized around release dates, global anticipation, or the need to respond. Rowling no longer moved at the speed of expectation. She moved at the speed of intention. That shift changed everything. Her work continued, but it no longer needed to dominate the world to justify its existence. Writing returned to scale, to craft, to the act itself. Some projects were received warmly. Others were contested. None were required to prove anything about her worth. For the first time in years, outcomes mattered less than coherence. Outside of writing, Rowling's choices reflected the same recalibration. She gave away vast portions of her wealth, not as spectacle, but as structure, a way to realign power with purpose. Charitable work became less about generosity and more about responsibility. Having experienced poverty firsthand, she understood that money does not save people by existing. It saves them by being directed. Her philanthropy was not abstract. It was informed. Rowling also became more visibly willing to accept consequence. She no longer sought protection from disagreement. She accepted that legacy, once established, does not remain neutral. It invites interpretation, conflict, reassessment, and sometimes, rejection. Legacy is not fixed. It breathes. For many, Harry Potter remains a place of refuge, a story that taught courage, loyalty, and the moral weight of choice. For others, Rowling herself became complicated, contested, uncomfortable. She did not attempt to resolve this contradiction. She lived inside it. That choice defined her later years more than any achievement. Legacy, she seemed to understand, is not about being preserved. It is about being engaged with, even when engagement costs admiration. Especially then. The world often asks creators to remain frozen in the moment they were most useful. Rowling refused that stillness. She continued to evolve, to speak, to act, knowing that growth rarely aligns with consensus. That refusal reshaped how her work would be remembered. Harry Potter did not change. But its creator did. And that tension became part of the story. Beyond books and wealth, Rowling's most enduring legacy may not be cultural dominance, but psychological permission. Permission to imagine while struggling. Permission to create without certainty. Permission to survive without becoming simple. She demonstrated that resilience is not a trait you acquire once. It is a decision you repeat. Her life no longer follows a heroic arc. It does not resolve cleanly. It exists in contradiction, admired and criticized, celebrated and questioned, influential and imperfect. That complexity is the legacy. Rowling's story does not teach that suffering guarantees greatness, or that success redeems pain. It teaches something quieter and more durable, that meaning is not granted by outcomes, but sustained by alignment. She did not remain the woman the world first fell in love with. She became someone harder to categorize. And in doing so, she preserved the one thing she had nearly lost, authorship over her own life. The story of J.K. Rowling is often told as a miracle. A woman falls to the bottom, writes a book, becomes a legend. But that version misses the truth. Rowling did not survive because magic arrived. She survived because she stayed when leaving would have been easier. Because she kept writing when belief was gone. Because she chose coherence over comfort, again and again. Her life does not prove that suffering leads to greatness. It proves that suffering reveals what you refuse to abandon. Harry Potter did not save her by making her famous. It saved her by giving structure to chaos. By giving shape to pain. By reminding her that even in the darkest places, choice still exists. That is the part we forget. The hardest battles are not the ones the world sees. They are the quiet negotiations you make with yourself, about whether you stay honest, whether you stay present, whether you stay. Rowling's story does not end with success. It continues with responsibility. With contradiction. With the courage to remain whole in a world that prefers simplicity. And maybe that is the real legacy. Not a wizard. Not a fortune. Not a franchise. But a reminder that sometimes, surviving long enough to finish the story is the most powerful act of all.